Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Leading Change. My name is Emma, and I have Minette with me today, and we're going to be talking through the concept of psychological safety in the workplace. But before I get to all the questions that I've got for you, can you give everybody an introduction?
Sure. My name is Minette Norman. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. The quick version of my long career is that I spent 30 years in the software industry, starting out as a technical writer and ending up as a VP of engineering at a large San Francisco software company. And I left the industry in 2019, not quite sure what I was going to do, but I knew it had to do with helping leaders do better because I had been a leader and I wished I had learned so much of what I learned late in my career, early in my career. And I also saw a lot of very, very poor leadership. So I left in 2019, started my business in 2020, and my business focuses on helping leaders and their teams create a psychologically safe and inclusive culture where everyone can play a role, everyone can fully participate, and everyone can do their best work. I do talks and workshops, and I've written two books, The Boldly Inclusive Leader, which was my book, and then a book I co-wrote with Carolyn Helbig, The Psychological Safety Playbook.
Well, and I was just saying, I've got one of them right next to me and the other up on my nightstand upstairs. So I'm digging into them. And so far, I'm loving what I'm seeing. When we were prepping for this conversation, the concept of the meeting after the meeting came up. And particularly in maybe workplaces that don't have a lot of the safe and psychologically safe workplace that you just mentioned. So, can you start by explaining what the meeting after the meeting is and what causes them to happen?
Yeah, as soon as I say the meeting after the meeting, when I'm with groups of people, almost everybody nods because they know what I'm talking about. But let me be really clear. So let's say you're in a staff meeting and the leader of the group says we're going to do this and this is the what is the strategy or these are our plans moving forward. And you're sitting in that meeting and you're going, there's no way we can meet that deadline, or there's no way we're going to do this on budget with the resources we have. But the leader of the group is not really open to hearing your perspective because they know what they want to get done. And so you leave the meeting nodding your head saying, yeah, it's all good. And the meeting after the meeting is a small group of you go off and say, that's never going to work. There's no way we can do this. What are we going to do? And then it devolves into gossip and fear mongering and all the things that happen because in the room, in the actual meeting room, it was not safe to be the one to say, this is so risky. I don't see how we're going to do it. Or, we're going to have to trade off either costs or resources or quality or time. One of these things has got to give. But no one was brave enough to say it. And the reasons why we don't speak up, that, it could be that in the past you got burned, you got shot down, you got humiliated for speaking up, or you just know that this leader is not open-minded. There are many, many reasons we don't speak up. And often what happens is that we miss out on something huge because we're having these side conversations when we really needed to have the conversation in the room. So that's what I mean by the meeting after the meeting.
So there's a couple of things that go through my mind. Like one, when we were in person, that meeting after the meeting oftentimes was like the kind of like hushed whisper, like by the coffee pot or whatever else. But it just makes me think of this video I saw yesterday that someone was talking about being angry at Microsoft and the functionality of how Teams works because they had an off channel with some of their coworkers where they do their meeting after their meeting, and they had called each other and were trying to work through something and then accidentally added their boss to their group chat with all of the meeting after the meeting content. And like she was explaining how this is like an absolute nightmare. But like after our conversation and reading the book, the first thing that went through my mind was like, this is like the asynchronous version of the meeting after the meeting in a chat somewhere.
Totally. Sometimes it's a private chat actually
Yes.
going on during the meeting.
Yes.
Have you ever noticed that?
Oh,
Like
yeah,
there's
or
like
when
a
you
whole
see
other
somebody
meeting.
texting maybe, like, trying to pretend like they're not, but you know that they're having a separate conversation with somebody else that's on the call.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
it happens all over the place, and so I guess the next logical question would be, when we don't have an environment that supports people and makes them feel safe to share their ideas, we see that type of stuff happening. What is the flip side of that? When we do have a culture that's supporting that safety, what does that look like in practice?
Yeah, and that's the one first of all, we all want to be a part of, because what it looks like is, first of all, we can speak up. We can say, hold on, like I'm seeing things really differently. We can share our ideas, even if they're not fully formed. We can debate one another. A lot of the time when it's not safe, we all agree, but we don't really agree. We're just politely pretending to agree. But in a safe environment, you can say, like, I'm seeing things totally differently. Can we talk about that? And we can talk about it, and we can realize that we're going to be stronger if we really look at all of these different perspectives before we come to a decision. And so, that's the biggest part, I would say, is like people can speak up. But it goes beyond that. It's like people can share their identities instead of trying to conform to some group norms or pretend to be someone they're not, or really mask who they are. So when it's safe, you can show up as yourself at work instead of putting on this mask or facade that we put on when we go to work. And then another thing that happens when it's safe is that we can actually talk openly about not only the things that go well, but about things that fail and don't go so well. And we can learn together as a group instead of hiding, when things don't go well and feeling like we have to manage our reputations all the while. And what ultimately happens is that every member of a group feels valued. They feel that their voice and their ideas are welcome, and they feel included. And so, the results of psychological safety are that performance goes up, innovation goes up because people do feel willing to share those far out ideas, and then employee engagement goes up because people feel they're valued for who they are and what they contribute. Mental health goes up, and overall just inclusion and feeling like I'm a part of this group go up. So all of these things are the result of psychological safety. And I think everyone who can kind of reflect on teams they've been a part of where they had a high degree of psychological safety, those are the teams you want to be a part of. And those are probably when you did your best work.
And I like one of the things that keeps going through my mind. I've got small kids right now, and anyone who's been a parent knows you are not perfect, even when you are trying your best. But like one of the things that I try hardest to do is kind of have that humility of like being able to say, I'm sorry when I make a mistake, or like listen to the feedback that my kids are giving me in certain scenarios. And it's not always easy. And I hate to say that, like, that parenting and management are the same, but I feel like once upon a time both leadership in a company and parenting was very authoritative, and now we know better that because I said so, or that like dictating of behavior, whether it's to your children or to your employees and your team, doesn't connect with the types of outcomes that we want to see, and it doesn't help us like get the best out of our children or our teams or anything along those lines. So I'm just thinking about, like, again, the leaders that I've enjoyed working with are the ones that were like, "Ooh, I made the wrong call there," or like, "Here's what I learned going through this scenario," like, or "You were right. I'm sorry I didn't listen to the feedback." Like all these things that I'm actively trying to do every day with my kids to pull through. And I think that this is so closely tied to the lessons that we've learned kind of across the board and what works and doesn't on the psychological side.
Yeah, and in fact, I'll highlight the subtitle of our playbook, which is Lead More Powerfully by Being More Human, which is exactly what you're talking about. We really connect with and respect the leaders who are human, not the ones who put up this like facade of perfection and knowing everything. And if you may admit a mistake, if you apologize for something that you didn't, that you regret, like people will respect you more, not think less of you. And so that being more human, and it's important not only in the workplace but in our personal lives. And it's funny that you mentioned being a parent, and how this all translates to that too. When Carolyn and I wrote the playbook, we were really thinking of it in a professional setting, but so many people have said that these lessons that are in the book apply to their personal lives, whether it's how they interact with their kids or their partner. And so they're really like life lessons, honestly.
Yeah, human skills go to
Exactly.
all of the human aspects of our lives. And I think that's like when I'm talking about change management, so often I find those connections to the practice of it day in and day out with my kids. And I'm finding the same thing as I'm reading through the book. And there's a couple of different things. Obviously, you've got the key principles within the book, but a lot of it comes down to the role that leadership plays in establishing this culture. And I'd love for you to share with everybody what is the role of the leader and what are some of the things that we can do to kind of like create this environment, and maybe what are some of the outcomes. I know you mentioned some of this already, but what are the
Mhm.
outcomes that we start to see with our teams then?
Sure. So I think that we can't really underestimate the role of the leader, because the leaders set the tone so much for how the culture is going to be, how people will interact, and people are looking to leaders as role models. And so I think sometimes leaders underestimate the power that they have. Like, you may just be a manager of a small team, and yet your team members are looking to you and they're emulating your behavior. They notice what you say and you don't say. They notice how you communicate, and they notice, for example, who you acknowledge and who you ignore, and who you say, like, that's a great idea, and who you might just stay silent with. So some of the things that leaders can do is, first of all, they have to become hyper self-aware of, like, how am I showing up, for example, in a one-to-one setting and in a group setting? How am I listening to people? Am I listening to everyone in the same way? Or am I letting my personal preferences and biases come into play and be like, I really appreciate the people who agree with me, and I'm not so much, appreciating or responding well to the people who might challenge me or disagree with me. So I think, one of the most important things, let's just start with how we show up as leaders, and do we actually invite divergent perspectives? That's a huge starting place for leaders. And, most of the time I've seen leaders, they have good intentions and they think that people will just speak their mind. But unless the leader deliberately invites other perspectives, people are not going to be sure if it's okay. And so, one of the first things in our book, in our playbook, is ask the question, what am I missing? Because what am I missing invites people to share, a risk or something that they see differently. And it also acknowledges that I am not all knowing and all seeing, even as the leader of this group. So inviting the different perspectives and then being willing to listen to them when someone does share a perspective that's different or that disagrees. And then one of the other really key aspects for leaders is that, we're human, we're all human, and we get triggered. So if someone says something to us that we don't like or that challenges us, we have to manage our response. Like, our initial reaction might be, I'm going to lash out at you. That's just my instinctive reaction of fight, flight, freeze. I'm under attack. You're attacking me, so I'm going to fight back and I'm going to say that's a terrible idea. But what we do if we react automatically is that we shut down the psychological safety. We make it unsafe to be the next person to offer a dissenting viewpoint or to ask a question. And so we have to just really, some of the things that I recommend are very simple, but simple doesn't always mean easy. And simple, for example, is you get a challenging response and you take a breath, you take a sip of water, you pause. And then in that moment, you can calm yourself and you can then thank the person. Like, even if you don't have a good response, you just say, thank you. Thanks for making me think. Thanks for the question. And then you can calmly respond, or you can say, I don't have a great answer, whatever, but you don't make the person feel bad for asking or for challenging. And so managing how we respond is really important. And then I guess the last few things I'd say about the role of the leader, and then I'll talk about the end results. But the leader also needs to declare in some ways that they care about creating a safe and inclusive environment, and that we're going to have team norms and agreements that will foster that environment. And so, for example, as the leader, I'm going to share not only my successes, but things that don't go well, so that we can collectively learn together. And we're getting to get into a practice of digesting our projects that go well and don't go well. We're going to do blameless postmortems and find out what didn't go well and what we can learn from it without shaming anyone or blaming. And we're going to have a different way of running meetings. We're going to run meetings to make sure every voice is heard, everyone has a chance to speak. No one dominates the conversation. We have a way to invite dissent. We have a way to discuss things, and we have a way to make decisions together. For example, and the result of all of this is that people will start to share important ideas that they were never willing to share before because they were afraid of being marginalized or they were afraid of retribution afterwards. And as a result, everyone's going to be more engaged in the work. the level of work is going to go up. And then, as I said, innovation is a big byproduct product of psychological safety, because those ideas that might have sent it felt too risky to share before, now I think it's okay to share it. And even if it's, a wild idea that in itself won't work, we have a way of discussing things and brainstorming together. And so everyone's more engaged, performance and innovation goes up. And honestly, people want to stay in this environment. They want to contribute. They want to do their best. They want to bring in new people. These are the teams that people are going to want to join. So it becomes easier to recruit new team members and retain the great team members you have.
I love that idea of like asking, what am I missing? But then also when you were talking through being able to stop and pause and like make it clear, even if you don't have a response. I used to be a teacher, and again, going back to kids will challenge you, kids will point out when you're wrong, kids will do all of these things. So you have to learn that humility quickly. But one of the skills that I learned while I was teaching that transitioned incredibly well into the corporate space was when I would get a question that I didn't know, especially from like a client or a customer, that I just very easily could say, that's a really good question. Why don't we find out the answer together? and
Yes.
and that like automatically started coming out of my mouth, like in the corporate environment. And it helped me build relationships in a very different way. And it helped me, like, again, when I was started getting into the point where I was like managing people or working with people kind of in informal leadership, that disarmed like that idea that all just because you're driving a project or whatever else. And it just makes you better by nature, because you get to go out and learn something new alongside these other people that are pushing you to do better every day.
It's such a good phrase. And I think it's really useful to have a phrase like that at hand so it becomes an automatic response when you don't, when you
Yes.
don't know something. I also like very much, I love that. Like, let's figure this out together. And I also love, like, if you have a group setting, is like, I don't have the answer, but there might be someone here who has more information than I do. And that's also very inviting and, makes people feel good if they do happen to be an expert in something. I led very technical teams, and I was by far not the most technical person in the group. And sometimes I would be like in a big all hands meeting, there'd be like 300 people, and they'd ask me a very specific question about some project we were working on. And I just got really used to saying, like, I don't have the answer. And I know, and often I would know like who in the room did. And I would say,
Mhm.
like, but Abby has the answer here. So let's turn to Abby. And then it would also give another person an opportunity to speak up.
Mhm. My other key phrase that became like second nature was, "Can somebody help me understand blah, 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 blah." And it was a nice way of asking, like, again, sometimes challenging questions, maybe on the other side of like when you're trying to like push and get an understanding at a deeper level for yourself. And that was another really nice one too. And like sometimes when you don't know the answer, like, I don't know, that's great. Does somebody else, like, can someone else help me understand? And that was a big part for me because I came into the tech world again with a teaching background. And so those
Right.
two kind of became my catchphrases, because I often didn't have all of the answers and I'd often needed help understanding.
Yeah, and it's also, there's something also really good about that, which is that when we ask clarifying questions, I mean, first of all, it's a great way to make sure that you really did understand the question. And it makes the other person also feel heard. Like that now the person cares enough to make sure that they got it. And
Mhm.
it calms you down, it gives you some time to think, and it invites others, right?
Yeah.
So all of that's really a
The
great
great
synergy.
catchphrases that you can have in your back
Exactly.
pocket.
Exactly. Exactly. Now, sometimes if it's not a question, I want to take it like another example. Sometimes it's not a question that you get, but sometimes it's just a challenge, right?
Mhm.
And it can be really can feel very personal. Sometimes people don't mean to, but they kind of go on the attack. And there's a great example of this. If you find on YouTube, you can find Steve Jobs getting challenged at one of the Apple developer conferences where he takes audience questions, and a guy raises his hand and he says, Mr. Jobs, you're a very smart person. However, in this case, you do not know what you're talking about. And it's really direct and it's really quite rude. And there's Steve Jobs in front of thousands of people. And he does actually a master class in how to respond to something very insulting. And it's quite amazing to watch. And I've definitely practiced this when it's happened to me. It's hard, but he just the first thing he does is he kind of laughs and you can tell he's uncomfortable. And then he takes the longest pause you have ever seen in public. And it's really quite long because you can tell what he's doing. He is not wanting to react in an angry way. And he's thinking, and you can see him thinking. And then you can also see the moment when he figures out how he wants to respond. And he kind of looks up and he turns to the person who has just said something really insulting and he says, "You know what? In many ways, you're right." So what he does is he acknowledges the person. He doesn't make them feel bad. And then he says, and something like, "And this is why I am still convinced that we should do this." And he just goes on with his presentation. But it's so amazing because, here he's been really called out in front of thousands of people. And he doesn't make the other person feel bad. And he doesn't lash out and he doesn't react quickly. He's just like calmly thinking. And so I think we can all learn from that example. It doesn't have to be as dramatic as that. And it doesn't have to be as long a pause as he takes, but it's okay. And, one of the things that I have actually shared and people really, again, respect this is like, "Can you give me a minute? Because that just hit me a little hard." Like to actually acknowledge that you're having a reaction, that you are human, and that you don't want to respond in the moment. So I just want to make sure that I think before I respond. And then, that also lets the other person know that, oh, maybe I said that pretty harshly and like, a little self-awareness for them as well. So it's okay to be human. We're all human. What we don't want to do is make other people feel bad. So we shut them down and then we undo all the good work we've been doing.
Well, thank you so much for joining me for the conversation and for everybody for watching. If you haven't already, be sure to check out the books that we talked about at the very beginning. I'll make sure to link them in the podcast description as well. But thank you again for your time and have a wonderful day, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Leading Change. If you like what you saw, be sure to come back on a weekly basis and subscribe for more expert interviews focused on digital transformation, change management, and emerging technologies.